and have been doing FHIR pretty much since Graham brought it to the organization. It consumes most of my work time and all of my spare time, but it's been a lot of fun, so I'm happy to be involved. From a questionnaire perspective, I've been the lead for the ONC Structured Data Capture project, which started 4 years ago, and I'm currently the lead for the National Library of Medicine follow-up to that, SDC Phase 2. So have had a chance to play with those resources a fair bit. Don't have a whole lot of time today, but I hope by the end of this presentation you should be familiar with what questionnaires are intended for, where they fit, and what they're not intended for, where you might be better off using other resources. We're going to take a look at the relationship between the FHIR core specification and the Structured Data Capture Implementation Guide, what SDC intends to add, and we'll talk a little bit about Argonaut questionnaire as well. And finally, we're going to do a dive into the Structured Data Capture Implementation Guide and look at what are some of the capabilities that it defines and where you might want to take advantage of some of those. So let's start with what questionnaires are for. Questionnaires are found throughout healthcare. We use surveys, we use case report forms. When you show up to visit a physician, first thing they often give you is a clipboard, getting you to fill out a bit of information, and then you go down the hall and they hand you the same clipboard and you fill out the same information. It's very common throughout the healthcare process, whether it's for clinical purposes or administrative purposes, financial purposes, research purposes. All of those different aspects of healthcare make use of forms. In the FHIR resource, a questionnaire is a very generic structure. It's a hierarchical recursive structure where you've got items, and items can be groups, they can be questions, they can be just general display information, and from that you can create pretty much any data structure you can imagine and use that to have very tight control over how information is presented and how information is collected. Built into that same structure is a degree of control so that you can determine what type of data you're capturing. So do you want to gather strings? Do you want to gather codes? Do you want to gather dates or even references to FHIR resources? Maybe pick some practitioners or some locations based on defined criteria. And there's also a degree of control in terms of this answer is required. This answer, you can have multiple values. This question only gets answered if question 5 had an answer of C or D, then it gets turned on, otherwise it gets left off. So there's a fair bit of capability within that general flexible structure. Questionnaire response is sort of the affiliated resource with questionnaire. Questionnaire says what kinds of questions can be asked. Questionnaire response represents a completed form. So when you have filled out a particular form for a particular patient on a particular date, you will get a questionnaire response. If you fill out the same form 3 days later, you'll get a separate questionnaire response. At one point, we actually had those two resources combined together, but we determined that it was much more useful to have them split apart because the systems that author and manage and maintain the questionnaires are quite distinct from the systems that actually gather the data in the questionnaire responses. Questionnaire responses are all about the raw data. So what did the user actually see? What was the text on the screen? What was the specific answers that they chose? Questionnaire responses are not that useful for query and decision support and all that sort of analysis because they are tightly tuned to specific forms. And of course, everyone asks the same questions in different ways. It's difficult, therefore, to get consistency in how your data is represented. So if you tweak the questionnaire just a little bit, your data is no longer going to be as comparable as if you were using, say, an observation resource or a family history resource. Example of that, in the FHIR resource, you have patient birth date. Single element, standard element, It doesn't matter what country you're in, doesn't matter what type of care or what purpose you're gathering the data, that's the element that the date of birth goes in. But with questionnaire, you have much more flexibility. So you can ask an open-ended question, gather a string as a response. You can gather patient's age. You can gather different levels of granularity. You can pick codes and have them correspond to particular ranges of age or date of birth. And clinicians are used to having that type of flexibility around data capture. And for certain types of clinical instruments, you need to have those questions phrased exactly that way, because you want your data to be comparable with the data that was gathered last year and 20 years ago, and you've been using the same instrument for a long period of time. Having that consistency of question is important. But in terms of being able to use that data across instruments and be able to use that data in decision support, it's a little bit more challenging. So quite often, you'll end up needing to have both. So you use the questionnaire to give you raw data capture, what you actually present to the patient or present to the clinician as they're going through and filling information out. You also use that as your raw source of truth. So if you ever want to go back and know exactly what the user saw, exactly what the user typed, questionnaire gives you that. Whereas the patient resource or the observation resource, the encounter resource, data has almost certainly been processed a fair bit between what was on the user interface and what's actually captured in those other FHIR resources. Your questionnaire is also useful in that it doesn't require a whole lot of FHIR smarts to fill out a questionnaire. You don't need to know observation and encounter and family history and allergy and tolerance and condition and the 20 or 30 other clinical or financial or other relevant resources that might be appropriate to represent the information that you're trying to gather in a particular instrument. You just have to know how to deal with questionnaire. So it's much easier to have a generic system that knows how to display and capture information using questionnaires to do your data capture than it is to have a system that understands all of those different resources, particularly as they continue to change. But if you want to be able to search and be able to find all of the patients who were born between 1960 and 1980, questionnaire is not going to be your friend. There are not good mechanisms to drill into items and then items within items and items within items to find particular data patterns. If you know a specific questionnaire, you can go and find all of the answers to that questionnaire for particular patients, but you then have to go and do the analysis of those directly. You can't go in and filter the way that you would with the RESTful interface on patient or encounter or something like that. Similarly, if you're interested in using CDS hooks or other decision support, you don't have access to the data inside of a questionnaire response the same way. So quite often you'll have the questionnaire response as here's our source of truth, we'll maintain it for audit purposes, or if somebody's looking for how is this data captured in a clinical trial, you've got that, but then you extract that information, put it into your family history, your observations, your encounters, your other resources for use in FHIR documents, in CDS hooks, invocation, etc. Structured data capture started about 4 years ago. It was funded by the US government, who's funded a fair bit of FHIR stuff. And FHIR was actually late to the game. They started this work with IHE on a non-FHIR based custom schema, actually. But their objective with structured data capture, and the reason that they brought FHIR in once we invented questionnaire and questionnaire response resources, was to get more consistency in how data was captured in the healthcare space, and in particular, to leverage data elements that were being developed by National Library of Medicine, Food and Drug Administration, National Cancer Institute, etc. They wanted to be able to have ways to leverage those and get information automatically filled out in questionnaire responses based on information that already existed in the patient's record. Most of you, I'm sure, have been involved in healthcare situations where you're filling out a form and you know that 80, sometimes 90% of the information that you're filling out already exists in the electronic health record. Your name, your address, your financial information, if that's relevant, what medications you're on, what allergies you have, all of those things already exist in the electronic health record, but still you fill them out again. And the notion that the ONC had was, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could fill out parts of the questionnaire, or maybe even most of the questionnaire, using information that was already in the electronic health record, so that all the patient or the practitioner or the end user had to do was review that information, say, yeah, that looks right, sign off, and be done. Or maybe answer 2 or 3 questions that weren't already present in the EHR, that the system wasn't smart enough to figure out what the answer was. But you would save yourself a great deal of data entry, and more importantly, you would improve data quality. Because the reality is that when people are filling out questionnaires, they don't necessarily always tick the right boxes, they don't necessarily always fill things out in a readable way, and whether it's the user filling things in wrong, or the person who's transcribing the data out of the paper form into an electronic system who gets it wrong, the chances of the information being accurate are much less than if you can grab it directly out of an existing source of truth system and just have the user validate that, yes, that looks right. So SDC went forth and created an implementation guide in IHE and created a separate implementation guide, actually 2 implementation guides in FHIR. One was focused on how to share data elements, and the other was focused on how to render questionnaires and how to populate questionnaires. Phase 2 of structured data capture started about a year and a half ago. And that was initiated by the National Library of Medicine, which is also U.S. government, just a different part. Their objective was to take the old SDC specification and update it, because FHIR had evolved since then, whereas the implementation guide had not. The original implementation guide was created as a US-centric specification, and one of the objectives with Phase 2 is to make it international in scope, because actually a lot of our initial implementation was not in the US environment, it was in Australia and other places. We also wanted to take into account implementer feedback. We had created a certain degree of extra sophistication in SDC questionnaires, and implementers said, that's great, we want more. More sophisticated capabilities, more control, more rendering capabilities. But the one mechanism that had been the focus of ONC, which is how to do population, how to get information out of the EHR into a questionnaire, we had proposed mechanisms to make that happen, and they were primarily focused around extracting information from CDA and loading that information into questionnaires. Nobody actually did that. There was no implementer interest in doing that, and it turned out that while it was good in theory, reliably extracting information out of CDA documents is not that practical. And there was far more interest in let's extract information out of FHIR resources, because it was felt that those tended to be tighter in terms of what data was present where, and more reliable. And most of the people who were interested in FHIR questionnaire were also interested in FHIR, and that CDA thing was old hat, and let's do the new thing. And so we actually had some systems that were already in production that were doing extraction, but they were doing it in a non-standard way. And the thought was, okay, well, let's update SDC and see if we can standardize those mechanisms so that we can get interoperable questionnaires that anybody can create and have that data extraction process run consistently. So we are currently targeting ballot of standard for trial use version of structured data capture in April of 2019. So we've sort of finished our scope and figured out what we want to have in there. What we have not done is polish the implementation guide and got all the examples and stuff in place. That's what we're working on right now. Main reason for having a structured data capture implementation guide in addition to the FHIR core specification has to do with FHIR's philosophy around what should be in the core spec. The core specification is focused on what do most systems do. What are most systems that deal with questionnaires capable of managing? What level of sophistication do they have? What can you sort of count on interoperability-wise as you are working across the spectrum of healthcare? And in the questionnaire space, that's challenging because there's a wide breadth of capability. There are some very simple systems that deal with very simple questionnaires, and there are some very complicated systems that have really, really sophisticated questionnaires. And so what is the sweet spot in terms of our sort of 80% rule? What should be in the core specification and what should be outside? We took a stab at that when we created the initial questionnaire resources, and we've since expanded that a little bit. Adding a bit more sophistication, moving certain things from extensions into the core specification. But there's a lot of capability that some systems would like to have that most systems that use questionnaires have no capability for. So the notion that most systems out there in the world would be able to extract information from an EHR and use that to automatically fill in a questionnaire, that's not true today. So saying that that's part of the core specification would be inaccurate. But we still need a way of standardizing how that works, and the way that FHIR says you do that is by defining implementation guides. So implementation guides allow us to define extra capabilities and also to set a base level of conformance that if you are going to play in this space and say that you conform with this implementation guide, you must do at least this much. You must be capable of using these elements, you must be capable of using these extensions. Here's the operations you need to support, either to invoke or to have invoked upon you. And that gets you to a place where you get greater interoperability and greater consistency, but with a smaller set of people, because the number of people who will be conformant with the overall questionnaire specification is going to be much larger than the set of people who will choose to conform to structured data capture, because there aren't that many people or as many systems that will be capable of doing that degree of sophistication. In SDC Phase 2, we have 6 different capabilities, or 6 different sections of the specification. The first is standardization around questionnaire workflow. So what are the different systems involved in questionnaires, form fillers and form managers and that sort of thing, and what are the expectations for what they need to be able to do, and also what are the expectations for basic metadata for questionnaires so that you can discover them, so you can go and find the relevant form to fill in at a particular time. Second is rendering capabilities, so greater sophistication there in terms of what forms look like. Greater flow control, so that you can have the answer to one question determine what other questions get answered, that you can calculate scores and that sort of thing. The ability to populate forms, so taking information out of the EHR and using it to fill in answers, and also the reverse, taking a populated form and saying, okay, patient has filled out a questionnaire that gives me family history, let me turn that into a bunch of family member history resources and a bunch of observations that I can then use for decision support or embed in FHIR documents or pass around in other ways. And then the final one is adaptive forms, which is a way of sort of hiding the complexity of questionnaires and instead just give me an interface that says, what's the next question? What's the next question? What's the next question? And as I fill out the form, I can keep hitting that operation and find out whatever the next question is, and I don't have to worry about what is the logic for the form. And that's useful in a few places. There are some instrument creators that don't want you to know what the secret sauce is that determines what the next question is. They don't want to tell you what the flow control logic is. They just want you to talk to their interface, and they will determine what that question is. But there's other people who might be willing to share the secret sauce, but nobody actually wants to write the code that's going to make the secret sauce work. So they create the black box that does the magic, and all that the client system, the EHR system, has to do is say what's the next question, and all the logic gets hidden behind the scenes. Of those capabilities, systems will choose what portions of it that they want to conform with. So perhaps you're interested in more sophisticated rendering capabilities and more sophisticated flow control, but you're not interested in pre-population or data extraction. That's fine. Or perhaps all you care about is adaptive forms and the rest of it doesn't matter to you. That's fine as well. There's a number of different ways to conform with SDC. In terms of what the implementation guide contains, we've got a number of capability statement resources that indicate what different systems in the questionnaire space should be able to do. We've defined a number of new extensions and provided a lot of documentation around how to use existing extensions. And we're in the process of defining a whole bunch of examples, which is, of course, what most implementers really want. Don't give me a whole bunch of explanation, just give me some examples and show me what the forms are supposed to look like, and I'll make it work from there. And that's what we're intending to provide so that implementers can quickly take the specification and go run with it. Our expectation in terms of where it's going to be used is all over the place. So we have participants from the clinical research space interested in it for case report forms and that sort of thing. We've got interest in it from public health, again, for public health reporting. But it's also relevant in the insurance space. So when you're doing claims processing, when you're doing predeterminations, and there's a specific set of information that you need to gather, being able to quickly go into the EHR, extract information, and then have a user verify that or add one or two more other pieces of information is certainly appealing. So anywhere where you're expecting there to be data in the EHR, but needing to have control over how that information is presented and guide people through answering a few questions, questionnaire is relevant. The other thing that's been happening in parallel with SDC is a project called Argonaut Questionnaire. For those of you who are not familiar with Argonaut, it's driven by a number of US EHR vendors. And the focus there is much simpler questionnaire, what do you sort of expect the Epics and Cerners and Allscripts and other major EHR vendors to be capable of doing in the questionnaire space. And the general answer from them has been not full SDC, because that's too hard, and we don't want to do that quite yet. And that's okay. Our expectation is that SDC is going to be probably fitting into those EHR systems using a smart app. So Smart on FHIR with full SDC capability, and then that runs inside the EHRs where you want that more sophisticated capability, whereas the base EHR capability will be more limited, but still a proper subset of structured data capture so that things work well together. In terms of structured data capture capabilities, so again, workflow. Who are the different participants involved in working with questionnaires? So the form filler is the client system. Form manager is the system that is involved in defining forms and making those available. Form response managers, if you've got a system that knows how to do pre-population, having that, or data extraction, having a system that's focus is doing that. Sometimes you just have a form receiver. They receive the data. It's sort of a black box. You submit and it goes away and you never see it again. But there's also form archivers where you have the ability to go and retrieve data that's been previously submitted. On the rendering front, some additional capabilities that SDC provides. If you need to embed HTML in your questions because you need colors or you need fancy formatting or you need embedded graphics, even little smiley faces. If you want to render your questions in tables, so you've got a bunch of questions going down vertically and a bunch of answers going across horizontally. There wasn't really a mechanism in the core specification that defined how to do that. SDC does that for you as well. If you have a form and you want to say, here's the questions in English, here's the same questions and answers in French, here's the same questions and answers in Spanish, how do you make that work and still maintain it as a single instrument? All of that's defined as part of SDC. In terms of behavior, how do you calculate scores based on the answers to other questions? How do you use calculations in decision points? So if the current score based on answers I've already filled in to date, is less than 0.3, then I'm going to display a particular question. Being able to calculate default values based on answers previously. If you are doing lookups of practitioners or locations or things like that, being able to display multiple columns, so rather than just a single code, you can display a code and a dose, or a name and a phone number, or a practitioner type, so displaying multiple pieces of information. How do you do that? Managing column widths, all of that sort of thing. In terms of data population, there's 3 different approaches to doing that. One is you invoke the populate operation and get back a questionnaire response that you then render yourself and prompt the user to fill things out. If you're a simpler system and you don't necessarily want to be able to render a questionnaire response, another possibility is we pass you back just an HTML page that you can display. And when you hit the OK button at the end of the HTML page, it causes the data to flow where it needs to go. A third possibility is we just pass you back a hyperlink. And the server that's actually doing the population stands up a dynamic page that handles all of the rendering, and all that your system does is redirect the user to that page to finish filling out the data that's been populated. The objective with form population is, of course, to reduce data entry and to improve data quality. And we want to get that data out of the standard data in a way that's computable. So we have to embed inside the questionnaire, inside the form design, what information is necessary for an external system to be able to say, okay, this particular piece of data in my database needs to go in this particular field in the form. There's 3 different levels of population that we've identified. One is where you actually fill in the answer for the user. The user doesn't have to do anything other than look at it and confirm that, yeah, that looks right. So things like what is the patient's name or gender or date of birth, that's pretty straightforward. There's no decision points necessary there. You can go look in the data in the EHR and extract that. But there are other types of information that we want to help with where you still need clinician review. So if I say, please identify all of the medications that are potentially relevant to this adverse reaction, I can easily go and find what are all the patient's current meds, but I cannot figure out which of those medications are relevant to this particular adverse reaction right now. That requires clinician decision. So I can't automatically populate the answer to the question, but what I can do is say, here's the list of meds, go pick the ones that you deem to be relevant. And that saves the person from having to go and dig into the medical record to find the medications to figure it out, but it still gives them the ability to make the decision of relevance. The third possibility is similar to the second, in that, again, human decision making is required, but this time rather than just picking from the available answers, you look at the information that's provided and then you synthesize an answer. So for example, Boolean question, yes or no, has the patient had similar procedures in the past? Well, I can bring up all of their procedures, but I don't want them to pick 1 or 2 or 5 of the procedures. I want them to answer yes or no. So there isn't a question of displaying possible answers and then picking one. It's displaying, here's relevant information, and then you, the user, after looking at that relevant information, will go and answer the question. So all of those mechanisms are supported in SDC Phase 2, where you can present that information to the user either as an automatically filled in answer, as answers that they can choose from, or as general contextual information that they can use in deciding what the answer should be. Yep. You're going to have to be really loud because I have a fan right there.
Is there guidance in the profiles saying whether you should use a fully populated answer, whether that can be changed by the form filler? Is it like a default and it's read-only, or do you allow it to be overwritten?
So the general expectation is that when you are populating information into a questionnaire response, you want the user to be able to review it and to override it. Because as wonderful as the software that we will write will be, and as perfect as the information in the EHR is certain to be, there is this small chance that it might not be quite right. And so you definitely want the user to be able to look at it and say, yeah, no, that's not the story that I want to tell. In some cases, the information might be totally right, but this is being submitted to an insurer or whatever, and the patient has said, no, they don't need to know that. I don't give you permission to share that. And so there's other reasons why you might change the answers as well. We're not getting in the way of that space, and I will not have the discussion right now about what is appropriate versus not to do in terms of what goes to certain organizations. The reality is that's the clinician's determination and the patient's determination. Good question. In terms of data extraction, 3 different mechanisms. We tried to come up with a single mechanism, but the reality is that there's different levels of sophistication that systems have. There's easy ways to do data extraction that only work in a small set of spaces, and then there's harder ways that will work everywhere but are much messier to create. So the first approach, observation-based, every question inside of your questionnaire gets tied to a particular observation code and possibly to a range. So I'm interested in patient's blood pressure, and I only want the values that have happened within the last 6 months because that's what's relevant to me. So go find me the most recent within this range. If you don't find anything within that range, then I can't populate. That's pretty straightforward, easy to do as you're authoring the questionnaire, but of course it only works for data that is represented as observations. The good news is that there's an awful lot of questionnaire answers that can be answered using data that's found in observations. The second approach is FIREPath based, and that says when you're filling out your questionnaire, you can get passed in context, like who is the patient and what is the encounter, and maybe a couple of other pieces of information. You can then go and use that information to query more information using standard FHIR RESTful query capabilities to go grab the patient's allergies or grab the patient's coverage information and bring that into context as well. And then you use FIREPath. I think we have presentations talking about that this week, so if you don't know what that is, go to those presentations to identify what are the particular data elements that are relevant, possibly do some calculations on them, and then additional extensions that say, okay, take the answer from that particular variable and plug it into this answer as the default value or the fixed value or something like that. The third approach uses StructureMap, which is a rather sophisticated mapping structure, mapping resource defined in FHIR, and you can say, I want to take a bundle of resources that looks like this, run it through a structure map, and that's going to produce my questionnaire response. That lets you do pretty much any kind of manipulation you can imagine, but there aren't a whole lot of people in the world right now who know how to author structure maps, and so the people who can author structure map questionnaires are pretty limited, but it does give you maximum amount of power. On the extraction side, same sort of thing. You're interested in taking data out of a completed form and making it available for searching, making it available for decision support, or just expose the data using a standard set of profiles. So you want to comply with US core, you want to comply with Australian core, Canada might get its act together and have a Canadian core at some point, and have that information discoverable with queries. So you want to be looking at the data in encounters and observation, etc. And we've defined a new operation for that called extract that takes in a questionnaire response and passes back a bundle of resources. In terms of how do you map that information into a questionnaire, much the same way as you do to populate the questionnaire. So you can use the observation approach. You can use structure definitions as well, although the mapping, of course, is expressed differently. Rather than going from a bundle into questionnaire response, you can go from a questionnaire response into a bundle. We also support definition-based mapping. So you identify this particular questionnaire corresponds to this profile, and then this particular group or this particular item within a questionnaire corresponds to a particular path within that profile. And that allows you to then generate a resource, including filling in fixed values as in the resource when you're generating a questionnaire response. Last piece, adaptive forms. The focus there is hiding all of the logic and just focusing on what is the next question to be asked. In practice, you can possibly pass back multiple questions at a time if you know, based on what's been filled in so far, the next 3 questions that they're going to have to answer are this. You can do that, but it's an iterative process where you say, what's the next question to get your first question, and then you fill in the answer and continue to go back and say, what's the next question, until the answer is none. You're done. You have provided all the information that we need, and there's nothing further required. And that's another custom operation that we've defined. We are currently actively in the Connectathon phase. So we are running questionnaire-based Connectathon in January, and we'll be running that again in May and probably in September as well. We hope to ballot in the May cycle. We're still doing work fleshing out examples and making that available to implementers. We have weekly calls. It's going to be a little bit late in Europe, but hopefully most of you will still be awake. So certainly welcome participation. Happy to have anybody join us, and you're certainly free to look at our minutes and see where we're going as well. The specification itself is posted at build.fire.org, so you can certainly go and explore that and see where it's at. There are a number of to-dos sitting in the specification right now. We're aware of them. We're working on them. The source itself is in GitHub, so you can poke around at that. On chat.fire.org, which I hope most of you have already discovered. If you haven't, please go there. It's the primary source for engagement with the community. There is a stream specific to questionnaires where we talk a lot about where we're going with structured data capture, but other things as well. So happy to see your faces there and to engage with questions or insights that you might have. Thank you. We've got about 2 minutes for questions.
In addition to the SDC implementation guide, there's one that's about patient-reported outcomes. Are you familiar with that one?
Yep.
How would you position the two? I mean, I have a hard time figuring out why I would use one over the other.
So patient-reported outcomes builds on top of structured data capture. There's actually a couple of implementation guides now that are building on top of SDC. The focus with patient-reported outcomes is that adaptive questionnaire approach. And they basically are adding some additional extensions that help to define the adaptive questionnaires. But yeah, so one of the nice things about how FHIR implementation guides work is that you can actually layer. So we can create a base implementation guide, which SDC is, and then create other implementation guides on top of that that set further and tighter expectations.
Right, thanks.
Anybody else?
Yes, I did a huge project 2 years ago with questionnaire responses for oncology team reporting. Oncology team reports are huge, and there are a lot of different ones for each cancer type, different one. One of the problems I ran into about 2 years ago was validating questionnaire responses against the questionnaire.
Yep.
You want to know whether the response is valid with respect to the valid validation of the questionnaire. And at the time, validation out of the box didn't work, so I wrote a bunch of schema calls myself to do exactly that. What's the state with validation of questionnaire responses at the moment?
Better.
I hope so.
Yeah. So we're running all of the examples that we're creating through the IG Publisher, which includes running the FHIR validator. That doesn't mean that we're perfect yet. I'm sure we'll be, as we start throwing more and more complicated examples at the process, we will stretch some things, but the other thing is when we find things that break, we will fix them. So it's improving, and it continues to improve. And when you find issues, report them either on chat.fire.org or using the proposed change link. All right, thank you all.